Hello, this is Professor Ferman, and welcome to this lecture on creating a culture of innovation. And in this lecture today, we will, of course, cover the main topic, creating a culture of innovation. We'll also discuss our third lesson on how to succeed in corporate America, and I will provide you with instructions about a quiz on this lecture that you will need to complete prior to our next in-person class on Zoom. So let's level set. Where are we in the innovation process right now? So we're still in the front end of innovation, but we finished the explore phase and we're getting ready to start the ideate phase. And in the ideate phase, we're going to be generating ideas to solve for problems and capitalize on opportunities that we uncovered in the explore phase. But I would contend that unless a company exhibits a culture of innovation, they can't be very effective in the ideate phase. And so this lecture is very important as a precursor or a prerequisite to getting ready for the ideate phase. Every company, to be as effective as possible in their innovation efforts, needs to adopt a culture of innovation. And so we will begin creating a culture of innovation. So as I've mentioned, I think it's difficult to innovate successfully if your organization does not have the proper culture. And the reason for this is because of what I call the bias against innovation. There's a natural tendency for people and companies to focus on doing the right things today in their company rather than planning for tomorrow. And at the margin, this makes perfect sense because the business as usual, which is planning for today, has a very compelling value proposition. The value proposition, I would argue, for business as usual is making money through a reliable and proven routine. Well, it's hard to stray away from that. If I give you a value proposition and I say, well, it's making money through a reliable and proven routine, why would I do anything else? And particularly, why would I invest time in business innovation, planning for the future? After all, the value proposition for business innovation is we're going to spend money to make changes that have uncertain outcomes. Now, if I'm the leader of the company and I have to figure out where am I spending my next dollar, am I going to spend it on making money through a reliable and proven routine, or am I going to spend it on making changes that have uncertain outcomes? And so on the margin, there's a bias against innovation because the money just naturally wants to flow back to business as usual. But we know the fallacy of this way of thinking. The fallacy is, and I've said this several times in this class, it's one of the key mantras of this whole class, is the business models of today will eventually stop working to make money in the future. And so those reliable and proven routines, at some point, they won't work. And sometimes, especially in the face of a disruptive innovation, they suddenly don't work. And I'd like to share the first of many videos I'm going to share in this lecture that will help to underscore this notion of the bias against innovation. And let me cue this up for you.
What is innovation? Life is made up of dots. Many, in fact most people, believe that the dots they see every day are all the dots there are. So life goes along according to these known dots. Decisions and solutions are based on these commonly known dots, as well as many conclusions too. Some companies build their entire businesses on these known dots. This we know as the status quo, business as usual. Then one day, someone comes along and sees one or more dots beyond the commonly agreed upon dots. Dots that others missed, dots that are ignored, dots that others have long since forgotten about. Some like these new dots and celebrate this new discovery, liking how things currently are and comfortable with everyday dots. Some protest these new dots. Some even claim they are invalid, or worse, are imaginary dots that don't even exist. Yet, it's these new dots that potentially change everything. What is the source of these new dots? notions, unexpected connections, ideas, possibilities, and imagination. Fire was one of these dots. So was the wheel, and the bicycle, and the automobile, and the computer, as well as the internet, the smartphone, and the tablet. In fact, many of today's common dots were at one time uncommon, newly introduced dots. So what is innovation? Those other dots, the ones others miss, and having the certainty to know that the dots you see are not only valid, but necessary if the world is to move forward.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that first of the several videos. And now I'm going to share a couple of stories that will help to further underscore the importance of creating a culture of innovation. Now, this first one's a little bit of a off-the-wall kind of story. It's the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. I'm sure most of you have never heard of Ignaz Semmelweis, but we actually indirectly may owe our lives to Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician who in the 1840s noticed that by washing hands before delivering babies, he could reduce mortality rates from 30% to 1%. Now that's just stunning. 30 mortality rates. That means 30% of infants were dying. And he was able to reduce that to 1% if he washed hands before delivering the babies. So pretty striking statistics. And so he championed the idea of washing hands before surgery. He was the first one to champion that idea. Unfortunately, surgeons of the day scoffed at the notion and were offended by the idea. They actually thought at that time that sickness and disease was spread mostly due to your social class standing, and poorer people spread diseases and people like physicians did not. And so the idea of washing their hands, which was something totally unnecessary, was offensive. But Ignaz, he had seen the data. And so he steadfastly continued to promote his very radical idea. But this just led to more stinging rebukes. And after several years of having his idea continually shot down, this led poor Ignaz to a mental health breakdown himself, and he was lured into an insane asylum where he shortly died. It took a whole generation later for his ideas to be adopted as Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister discovered germ theory. So Louis Pasteur, think pasteurization, Joseph Lister, think Listerine, and they discovered there really was something to washing your hands. And so after that, surgeons did actually begin in the late 1800s to wash their hands before surgery. So the moral of the story here, it's embedded in our culture to be cautious and guarded when sharing ideas. We don't want to be laughed at. We don't want to be scoffed at. We certainly don't want to be lured into an insane asylum. And so we are very guarded about sharing ideas. We come up with a radical idea, but we're a little afraid of telling people about it. And that tells me that we still don't live in a culture of innovation, because in a culture of innovation, you're not afraid to share your ideas. So the moral of the story is to effectively innovate, to effectively generate great ideas in our organizations, we have to unlearn that behavior of being afraid to share an idea. And we have to create an environment to do that in which no one's laughed at and no one tells you you're crazy just because you have what sounds like a radical idea. We need, in short, everyone to feel comfortable sharing all the ideas they have, even the crazy ideas. Einstein had a very important quote. In fact, it's when I was searching for a quote to put on the back of my business card when I started Ferman Innovation back in 2013, I picked this quote because I thought it was that important. If at first the idea is not absurd, then there is no hope for it. Einstein's basically telling us the greatest ideas in history at first sounded absurd. And if the idea itself doesn't sound absurd at first, then it's probably not that big an idea. And there are many great ideas that were originally rejected. The personal computer, the notion of treating ulcers with antibiotics. The physician who came up with that idea, he was castigated by the medical community for the first several years until it was proven that there actually is a bacterium that causes most ulcers and can be treated with antibiotics. Alternating current as opposed to direct current was originally rejected as an idea. If some of you saw the movie The Current Wars, which came out a couple of years ago regarding the battle between Thomas Edison, who was promoting direct current, and Nikola Tesla, who was promoting alternating current for how electricity would be distributed. That's what the movie is about. And Tesla, of course, was right. And we all use alternating current in our power systems and our power grids today. Airbnb and Star Wars also were great ideas that were originally rejected. So the moral of the story, again, poor Ignaz, he lived in an environment in which there was little or no receptivity to change. And so the world had to wait a whole generation to reap the benefits of his discarded idea. And in order not to repeat this mistake in our organizations, we need to create an environment that is receptive to change, in which ideas can be freely shared and tested. We need to create a culture of innovation. And what happens when you have a culture of innovation? Well, magical things happen. Change is embraced rather than feared across the whole organization. And alternative solutions are encouraged rather than dismissed. And employees feel they can openly share their ideas rather than feel the need to restrain their creative thinking. And I would contend that receptivity to new ideas is still lacking in modern times. Nearly all major Hollywood studios turned down George Lucas's screenplay for Star Wars. Some of the most profitable ideas in history have been rejected. When Larry Page and Sergey Brin first got started on their search engine project, they decided it was too difficult and was going to take too much time to develop while they were working on their PhDs at Stanford. So they decided to sell Google, but they were repeatedly rejected. So only then did they decide, well, they have to go into business themselves. And the founder of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, also was repeatedly rejected. Here is an actual email he received in which he was being rejected yet again for capital and financing for his new idea, Airbnb. And this was back in 2008. So a culture of innovation must be created for ideas to flourish. So how do we do it? Well, there's no single magic method for creating a culture of innovation. What follows here is some of the best and latest thinking on the subject. So how do we build a culture of innovation? Well, the first thing you can do is to create a chief innovation officer role and an innovation department. When you have a C-suite person who can garner the resources necessary, has the ear of the CEO of the company, when you have that chief innovation officer in place and they have an innovation department, that goes a long way to being able to create a culture of innovation in the organization. Including innovation as a part of everyone's job, that also can be a big help. Encouraging a free flow of information and ideas across the company, essentially creating trust within your organization. That's an essential element to creating a culture of innovation. Similarly, or following that last bullet point, breaking the silo mentality, encouraging departments to work together is also going to have a big impact. Allowing improvisation so that you can change plans in reaction to market changes is going to be very important to creating a culture of innovation. And lastly, treating innovation as a continuous process. not a series of one-off projects. As I've said before in this class, I would contend innovation is a skill, just like learning how to play the piano or learning how to play basketball. You don't get great at things by just doing them once in a while. You become great at things by doing them over and over again repeatedly. When you treat innovation as a continuous process, you get very good at it. And if the whole organization is doing it, you create a culture of innovation. Now we're going to go into a deep dive on all 6 of these items on the ensuing slides here. So first, let's start out talking about the Chief Innovation Officer role. So what would a Chief Innovation Officer do at a company? Well, I would contend there's a number of things that a Chief Innovation Officer could do that would all help to create a culture of innovation. First, the Chief Innovation Officer is going to create the model for innovation in the company. So every company needs to have an innovation process. And the Chief Innovation Officer is going to decide what's the model for innovation, what's the innovation process going to be in our company. And then the Chief Innovation Officer can also introduce various techniques and processes that will further enable innovation, maybe enable rapid innovation. They're also going to help ensure that funding is available for innovation. So it's hard to innovate, it's hard to get anything done in a large organization if you don't have the proper funding. Again, by having a Chief Innovation Officer role, somebody who's at the C-suite table, they can get the funding for that innovation team. The Chief Innovation Officer can also be the person who's inspiring people that are managing innovation projects. So, all the innovation projects are things that or especially the breakthrough innovation projects, they're things that are future looking, and you need to have somebody that's going to help keep people inspired, giving them, instilling that attitude and thought process that people can do things, they can make things happen, they can make a difference. The Chief Innovation Officer should also be developing external alliances and partnerships, recognizing maybe we can't do it all by ourselves. And there are times when we do need to reach out to other people outside the organization to get ideas, to get expertise. They're also similarly going to bring new ways of thinking to the company. So they should be always looking at what's going on in the industry and what's new thinking on how we do things, and that we should bring to the company, and not just, we don't want to just rely on information we're generating. We want to look outside the company, make sure we have the latest thinking in our industry. And the Chief Innovation Officer is going to have to make tough decisions sometimes, when to terminate or change directions on projects. So if you have a number of innovation projects in the works and you need to find budget to develop new ones, or not everything has the budget to make it to launch, you're going to have to make some tough decisions. When is it time to pull the plug on certain projects or change directions on certain projects? And the Chief Innovation Officer should be encouraging all employees to challenge the status quo, to find new ways of doing business. And finally, I like to think in terms of a portfolio of innovation, and that the Chief Innovation Officer is the manager of this portfolio. So I liken this to an investment portfolio. If you're managing investments, investment theory says you shouldn't have just one asset. You should have a diversified portfolio of assets. Some things that are maybe high risk but have a high potential for future gain, and some things that are low risk but have a certain gain. Well, for innovation projects for a large organization, we should take the same approach. We should have a portfolio of innovation projects, some that are things we would categorize as potential breakthrough innovations. They're high risk from the point of view of they might never get to launch, but if they do, they might disrupt the market and give us incredible returns. On the other hand, we don't want to put all our eggs in that basket. We want to have some that are just incremental innovations, some things that are just making us a little more competitive, and maybe they're even going to make revenue for us this year. They're going to help keep us, help generate additional revenue without a lot of risk. Where they're incremental, we kind of know they're going to work. So from the chief innovations officer's point of view, you want to make sure you've got a balance in your portfolio of innovation initiatives. Now, the second item I said about how to increase or how to create a culture of innovation is including innovation as a part of everyone's job. And I think this is really important. It's not enough just to have an innovation team. If you just have an innovation team and nobody else is thinking about innovation, well, first of all, you've got a limited number of people thinking for the future, and that limits the ideas. And also, sometimes you can create animosity. If some people say, "Well, the innovation team, they're doing all the fun stuff. We're stuck here just doing all the grunt work to keep the business running." And of course, you've got to have people running the business as usual functions. But I think it's important to give everybody the opportunity at a minimum to be able to share ideas. So everybody should have some type of innovation functions built into their job description, even if it's just to take some time each week to share ideas. It's also very important that our top executives embrace and reinforce innovation as a priority. So if it's only the chief innovation officer and nobody else is bought into innovation, that chief innovation officer is going to struggle. So all the top executives have to embrace that innovation is an important part of the company and reinforce that on their teams, it's important to have their people participating in the occasional brainstorming session, sharing ideas and other activities where there might be a little, where their employees that are outside the innovation team might spend a little bit of time working on future-looking efforts. And it's important to have your senior executives continually being inspiring employees to a higher purpose. In companies like Tesla or Apple, you have senior leaders that are doing this on a daily basis. Next was encouraging a free flow of information and ideas across the company and breaking down that silo mentality. Trust is a critical trait in companies that exhibit a culture of innovation. When you trust other employees, then you're more willing to share ideas because you know that people you share the ideas with, they're not just going to steal your ideas and say it was their idea. Where they're, so it's important that people will just work together better when they know they can trust each other. So trust is kind of one of the bedrock foundation traits you need to have in a culture of innovation. And that helps encourage people working together. So we need to encourage people working together. You don't get that unless you have the trust. And ultimately, we want to embrace what's called open innovation. This is where you can go to any employee, or you can even go outside the company to look for ideas. And we will talk more about open innovation when we get to the ideate phase and how to manage that. Next is allowing improvisation to change plans in reaction to market changes. So we know the markets are changing all the time. The business environment's changing all the time. We can't be rigid in our plans. We have to allow the freedom to challenge the status quo, we have to allow any employee to challenge, why are we doing the work the way we're doing it? Maybe it needs to change. And so you have to encourage that type of challenging in the status quo, encourage changing the way work is done, even encouraging how we manage innovation. So I am continually making tweaks to the innovation process as I've been describing it to you in this course. So I probably have never run innovation projects the exact same way twice, because I'm always innovating around the innovation process, always questioning the status quo for how I do things when I run an innovation project. And lastly was treating innovation as a continuous process, not a series of one-off projects. So it's important, first of all, to have an innovation process. We've talked about this several times. And it's important to continuously leverage that innovation process. It's not good enough to just have an innovation process and then we'll dust off that process and use it when we've got a problem. You need to continuously go through that innovation process so that you get good at it. And so you have a continual flow of ideas in the company. And as part of that, we want to be pushing ideas forward. And it's not enough to just come up with ideas and then they just kind of sit around and nothing happens with them. And we also want to have an environment where people know they can be rewarded for their ideas. So people are going to be more likely to share ideas if they're going to get credit for them, if they're not going to get stolen, and particularly if they're going to get rewarded for them. And we want to be encouraging experimentation with new technologies. We're going to take a look later in the semester at a company, 3M, which specializes in over 40 different technologies, and they're continuously experimenting with new technologies to come up with new ideas for new products and services. And we want to be providing innovation training across the company because we want all of our employees to ultimately understand and be able to participate in some aspects of the innovation process. And as I've mentioned several times, you actually have to practice innovation. You can't just be talking about it. It's not enough just to train on it. You actually need to be doing it and doing it over and over again. And we also have to be aware of what I call several inhibitors of innovation. Some of these are just the opposite of some things we've been saying, but it's very important to think about them from this point of view and make sure that we're not seeing these inhibitors in our organizations. And so let me run through these 6. So the first one is thinking about the customer, insufficient knowledge or lack of focus on customer needs. That's when we talked about failures of new products. I pointed to the core reason why I think most new products fail is a lack of focus on the customer in the innovation process. So if we see there's a lack of focus on the customer, that's a critical inhibitor of innovation. Secondly, organizational bureaucracy. Organizational bureaucracy can often be a killer if companies are working in silos and the silos won't talk to each other. That's a problem for innovation. Lack of time and resources. We mentioned earlier, that's one of the things a chief innovation officer can help overcome, making sure that there is time and resources available for innovation in the company. Lack of collaborative efforts across different functional areas. So that kind of goes hand in hand with the bureaucracy. If we don't have collaboration across the company, we limit the sharing of ideas, and that inhibits innovation. Lack of funding or inconsistent funding. We've talked about that before, and that's something that a chief innovation officer can make sure we've got that funding for innovation. And then finally, inertia, comfort with business as usual, the traditional way of doing things. When we get too comfortable and we don't challenge the status quo, and we make that mistake that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture of the bias of innovation and continuously just focusing on the value proposition associated with business as usual, when that happens, that's an inhibitor of innovation. And now I want to share with you another story. It's a story about how the culture of innovation was created at NASA. Now, I would argue that NASA has created an outstanding culture of innovation going back to the late 1960s, when they were successful in what was perhaps the greatest innovation project in history. Apollo 11, landing a man on the moon. It was one of the most audacious goals this country ever set out to do. And kind of the sad thing is 50 years later, we actually don't have the capability at the moment to replicate what was first achieved in 1969 and was last achieved in 1972. So we're at about 50 years since we landed a man on the moon and returned him safely to the Earth, one of the great innovation projects ever. And this success, I would argue, was due in large part to a great culture of innovation that they had at NASA that we're going to explore here in a couple of minutes. But the interesting thing is that NASA did not start out with great success or with a culture of innovation. At the very beginning of NASA in the late 1950s, there clearly was not a culture of innovation at all. There was very much fixated thinking at the top. It was very bureaucratic. And the people that worked there, they were very limited in the scope of ideas they were allowed to come up with. When they first started thinking about how are we going to send men to the moon, there were certain ground rules of what was deemed acceptable ideas. and there was intolerance of ideas from lower levels. And as a result, we were behind in the space race in the early 1960s. It was the Russians who achieved several astonishing firsts in space. The Russians were the first to launch a satellite in 1957. They were the first to put a man in space in 1961, and also in 1961, the first to have a man orbit the Earth, while America was repeatedly failing in the late 1950s and upward even into 1960. And so let's take a look at some of America's early failures in attempts to send men into space. Now, fortunately, what I'm going to show you was an unmanned rocket as we were preparing testing rockets that would send the first man into space, Alan Shepard, or the first American into space. So this was an unmanned rocket, and I think around 1960.
On December 12, 1959, the United States awaits its sixth attempt at launching their newest and most advanced rocket at the time, the Titan I. The Titan I was the U.S. first multi-stage intercontinental ballistic missile. The rocket was fully fueled up, and upon engine ignition, the rocket began shaking pretty excessively. So excessively, in fact, it actually set off the flight termination system while it was still on the pad. Moves.
And so they said on the video it was actually 1959. And just 2 years later in 1961, Alan Shepard was the first American to go into space. You can see that Alan Shepard was pretty brave, sitting on top of one of those rockets just like that one, similar to that one, not that exact kind. So the bottom line is NASA was not succeeding, did not have a great culture of innovation, and then something changed. And the credit goes to President Kennedy, who in shortly after Shepard's first flight in around April of 1961, Kennedy set the objective that changed everything. And I'm going to show you the video of where he announces the new goal for the space program. And this was at a joint session of Congress.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So that was when he first laid out that crystal clear objective that we're going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to the Earth. And then, and that's what kind of galvanized the thinking at NASA. Now we have a crystal clear objective. Everybody's on the same page. What are we doing? And then he laid out in a speech, a very famous speech the next year at Rice Stadium in Texas, further inspired people as to why we had set this goal. And I want to share this very famous speech with you as well.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
And so Kennedy set the objective and then followed it up with inspiration. And that's what got everything moving at NASA. But still, it still didn't quite have a culture of innovation in the ranks of the NASA bureaucracy. They're not quite ready yet. And that's where I'm going to bring in the story of John Hubble, kind of like Ignaz Semmelweis, somebody you never heard of, but he's one of the heroes of the story of sending the man of Apollo 11, sending men to the moon and return them safely to the Earth. You see, the initial plans to send a man to the moon and return them safely to the Earth were developed by a very famous rocket scientist, the man who led the development of the Saturn V, the head of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, Wernher von Braun. He was the genius behind rocket technology in the United States. And his plan was called direct descent, in which we would send a very large rocket all the way to the moon. That very large rocket would land on the moon, and that very large rocket would take off again from the moon and go back to the Earth. It was called the direct ascent method. But there was a problem with the direct descent method that John Hubble identified. Now, John Hubble was not one of the leading people at NASA. He was a little known NASA aerospace engineer. He did not even work at the Marshall Space Flight Center that was developing the rockets. But he determined that direct descent would not work. He determined it was too difficult and too dangerous to land a large rocket on the moon and try to blast it off again, especially having to contain all the fuel to blast off and make it all the way back 250,000 miles to the Earth. And so Hubble championed what was called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous Method, or the LOR method. Now, you can see in this picture, if you're not familiar with what they actually did in Apollo 11 and 12 and 13 and so on, when they went to the moon, there were two vehicles. There was what was called the command module and the lunar module. And initially, the two vehicles, after being propelled into space by the Saturn V rocket, the two vehicles were connected together. When they got about 60 miles from the moon, so they go 250,000 miles to the moon, when they're just 60 miles from the moon's surface, two of the three astronauts that are in the command module, they climb into this funny looking thing, the lunar module, and they separate and they go the 60 miles down to the lunar surface. And then they stay on the lunar surface, and when they're done, they just blast off with this little lunar module that all it needs is enough fuel just to get back 60 miles to the command module. And then the command module just needs a little boost and uses the slingshot effect of going around the moon to be propelled to go back to Earth. So that is, it's a little complicated, but that is called LOR, the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous Method. And this is what Hubble determined was required in order to safely send a man to the moon and return him back to the Earth. But as you can imagine, Hubble's idea was not just blanket accepted right away. He wasn't even working in the Marshall Space Flight Center. But even worse, his idea was ridiculed by all the spacecraft design teams. One of the key designers of some of the early spacecraft, a guy named Max Faget, who was very high up in NASA, he was particularly vicious in shooting down Hubble's idea. One quote from him is, "His figures lie. He doesn't know what he's talking about." But like Ignaz Semmelweis, Hubble persisted. And in a last-ditch attempt, after being repeatedly shot down, he went over everybody's head. He sent a letter directly to Robert Siemens, who was one of the couple of senior people at NASA. And as this was a pretty audacious move, and he sends this, here's a copy of the letter you can see here. And one of the key lines was this: "After reading this, you may feel you are dealing with a crank, a crazy person." But apparently the letter got circulated around, and by mid-1962, Wernher von Braun came around, and in what was a surprise decision, he selected the LOR method. And from that point on, from mid-1962, all the missions, all the Gemini and Apollo missions were designed with lunar orbit rendezvous in mind as how we would go to the moon. And there's a beautiful post-log to this story. On July 20th, 1969, the day that Apollo 11 landed on the moon, the first team to land on the moon, Hubble was invited to be one of the few people that would be inside mission control that didn't actually have a working role in mission control. And of course, Werner von Braun, as the leader of the Saturn V development, he was there, and he thanked Hugh-Bolt for persisting in promoting the LOR method. And here's a quote from Hugh-Bolt. He said, "I had the privilege of sitting there and watching the whole mission. When the landing took place and the touchdown was made, all of us stood up and started clapping. But at the same time, we were shh, shh, because we didn't want to miss a fraction of a second of history being made. And von Braun sat in front of me, and he made the okay sign and said, 'Thank you, John.' That was one of the biggest rewards I've ever had," said Hugh-Bolt. And now I'm going to give you the opportunity to hear directly in a video that John Hugh-Bolt made about 50 years ago. And this was actually prior to Apollo 11, but when the lunar orbit rendezvous method was being used in some of the early Apollo flights. And so I'll introduce you now to John Hugh-Bolt.
Shortly after NASA came into being in 1958, the idea of using LOR, lunar orbit rendezvous, as a way to going to the moon appealed to me tremendously. It appealed to me from the point of view that I could recognize all the back effects. Development, testing, fabrication, transportation problems would be eased. I knew, however, that it would meet with much opposition. People, in fact, would probably think I was crazy. I made some back-of-the-envelope types of calculations. Other type of analyses also appealed to me from the point of view that it would be cheaper, quicker, safer, and much more reliable. It was an uphill struggle all the way, but one by one, various factions of the NASA began to see and recognize the merits of the scheme. They all finally went for it. I'm, of course, very much interested in the present Apollo 9 flight because it represents the checkout of the lander module, which will be a key piece of equipment in accomplishing the final landing mission.
Okay, and we'll come back to our slides. So I would argue that von Braun's willingness to change, that was one of the keys towards an emerging culture of innovation. If von Braun didn't recognize we have to change our thinking, we have to operate a little bit differently, and he doesn't accept Hugh-Bolt's idea, I don't think they make it to the moon, at least not in 1969. Now, another man that was really instrumental in helping create the environment that enabled the success of Apollo 11 and the rapid problem solving that saved Apollo 13, and we're going to discuss that later in the semester, was Gene Kranz. And you can see him pictured on the right. Gene Kranz was the mission control flight director of Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. Apollo 11, again, was the very first mission to land on the moon. You've probably all heard of the famous quote, "Failure is not an option." That was famously associated with Gene Kranz, although he says he never actually said it, but he liked the quote enough that he made it the title of his autobiography, which is a fascinating book if you're ever looking for something to read about NASA. His mantra actually was work the problem. And he liked to talk about teams coming together. A quote from him is, "Success would only come as a team, so we became one, and we learned to check our egos at the door." And I want to share with you a couple of videos about Gene Kranz. The first one is Gene Kranz talking about leadership.
There were no smaller roles in mission control. We were a team. And we went into that room as a team, and we came out as a team. Every player, right down to the last secretary. I had to be smart enough to ask the first good question. After that, that would get the communications flow going so that we could address problems. Failure is an ingredient in life. It's an ingredient in growing. Probably the worst failure of my life and our lives as mission controllers is when we lost our crew in the Apollo 1 fire. And we lived with that failure, and what we did about it, though, became very important. We sat and established a set of values, a set of standards that we would all live up to. They were expectations for ourselves and for others. Failure is an incredible, intense learning process. And if you use it as a learning process, it was worthwhile. I'm Gene Kranz. I was a former flight director during Gemini, Apollo, and Skylab, and later I served duties as the Director of Mission Operations for NASA Johnson Space Center.
So you can hear Gene Kranz talking there about some things that are really critical in creating a culture of innovation. He talked early on there about listening to his people. A great leader that's going to inspire innovation has to be willing to listen and has to be willing to encourage discussion, to address problems. He talked about that. And they have to be willing to learn from failure. And that was critical at NASA. He talked about the Apollo 1 fire. And that's something that happened in January 1967, 2 years before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. There was a fire while they were just testing Apollo 1. It was actually just sitting on the launch pad. They were going through a rehearsal with the astronauts in the command module capsule on the launch pad on the ground, and a fire broke out in the capsule, and 3 crew members died. And it was a tragedy. And they took a year to understand what had happened and completely redesigned the entire Apollo spacecraft so that they wouldn't have those types of problems again. And without that redesign, they probably would not have made it to the moon at the end of the 1960s. And so Kranz was a key part of that, as you heard him talk about. Now I'm going to share with you another video for fun here. Gene Kranz was played in the movie Apollo 13 by actor Ed Harris. And I want to share with you a short clip from the movie Apollo 13, where you see a little bit about Gene Kranz's style of leadership.
Now, in the meantime, we're going to have a frozen command module up there. In a couple days, we're going to have to power it up using nothing but the re-entry batteries.
We've been tried before. Hell, we've never even simulated it before, Gene.
Well, we're going to have to figure it out. I want people in our simulators working re-entry scenarios. I want you guys to find every engineer who designed every switch, every circuit, every transistor, and every light bulb that's up there. Then I want you to talk to the guy in the assembly line who actually built the thing. Find out how to squeeze every amp out of both of these goddamn machines. I want this mark all the way back to Earth with time to spare. We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
And so there you hear that famous quote that Gene Kranz says he never actually said. Now I want to share with you another story. It's one I just found out very recently. Another one of these people who have never quite received the fame, but they probably were extremely instrumental to the success of their organization. And this is another person in NASA, kind of like John Hewbolt, a guy named Bill Tyndall. And Bill Tyndall helped create the culture at NASA in which ideas could be freely served. I just came across some stories about Bill Tyndall as I was reading about Apollo 15 several weeks ago. We just had the 50th anniversary of Apollo 15 this summer. And in the book that was written by Commander Dave Scott, I came across this paragraph that I thought was really intriguing. He said, Tyndall is one of the unsung heroes of the space program, in my view. His major contribution was to introduce a brilliant forum in which information and ideas could be freely and directly exchanged between all of those working on different aspects of the program, from the astronauts to engineers to managers and technicians. Now, when I read that paragraph, I kind of just like jumped up out of the chair, and I had to learn more about Bill Tyndall, because effectively what it sounds to me like is he was serving as like the head of ideation at NASA in the mid and late 1960s. As I've told you before, I was the head of ideation at Bank of America in around the 2010 timeframe, and so I was extremely interested in Bill Tyndall and wanted to learn more about him. And so what I learned was fascinating. He helped everybody to make sure they understood key issues. He moderated these forums in which they shared ideas, and then he would summarize those forums in what came to be very affectionately known around NASA as Tyndallgrams. And his Tyndallgrams were revered for the adeptness at summarizing the key points and action items from hours of technical meetings. And we're gonna talk about this a little bit in the ideate phase, where it's not enough to just generate ideas if you can't accurately capture and write up the ideas. And so Tyndall was not only good at helping to create these forums to generate the ideas, but he was also good at summarizing, or what I'm going to call in subsequent lectures, headlining ideas. And people like Gene Kranz, I later found out, also extolled some of the greatness of Bill Tyndall and the impact that Tyndall had on the NASA organization and helping to solve ideas to help ultimately make Apollo 11 successful. In Gene Kranz's autobiography, Failure is Not an Option, he wrote about Tyndall. If there should have been a lunar plaque left on the moon from somebody in mission control or flight control, it should have been for Bill Tyndall. Tyndall was the guy who put all the pieces together, and all we did is execute them. And I thought it was fascinating uncovering these stories about Bill Tyndall, because I've read quite a bit about NASA, and I had never come across this name previously, prior to reading first in that Dave Scott book. And then I had to go back to the Failure is Not an Option book and find this quote. And then an interesting thing happened along the way. I have a colleague who is a professor, engineering professor. He teaches aerospace engineering at Lehigh University, Dr. Terry Hart. Dr. Terry Hart's in his late 70s, but 35 years ago, or 37 years ago, he was an astronaut. And he flew on the space shuttle in 1984. And he also had the honor of being the Capcom in mission control for the very first space shuttle flight in 1981. The Capcom is the person who is the only person in mission control who speaks directly to the astronauts. And what they like to do, or at least what NASA liked to do back at that time in the Apollo missions and in the space shuttle, at the time of the space shuttles, they always wanted to have an astronaut in mission control who would be the single point of contact to talk to the astronauts, because they knew that the astronauts would be able to understand each other. The astronaut in mission control would be able to summarize what he just heard from what he or she just heard from the flight director and other people, and tell the astronauts what they need to know in language that they would understand. So the Capcom's got a very important role, and Terry Hart had that role. And so I called Terry and did a little interview with him. And I asked him about Bill Tyndall and Gene Kranz. And he of course worked with Gene Kranz. Gene Kranz was in mission control also during that space shuttle flight in 1981. But what I didn't know, and I was very excited and surprised to hear, was that he knew Bill Tyndall. That Bill Tyndall was still at NASA in the late 70s and early 80s, was still leading some of those sessions. And so I want to share some excerpts of this interview I did with Dr. Terry Hart. And here he talks about specifically about the contributions of Bill Tyndall. And I am sorry, I'm trying to queue up this. Let me try something else here.
He understood systems engineering before the phrase existed, because it really, back in those days, the concept of doing good high-level top-down system engineering was something that really hadn't been done yet. But he understood that from the very beginning, so he was able to put together process basically during Apollo, which carried on, of course, in the shuttle then, where all the operations people and all the engineers that were involved in the design of the vehicle or the mission would come together in meetings on pretty much a weekly kind of basis, go through a series of topics to design how we're going to do the mission, and maybe more importantly, how we're going to do it when something doesn't work right. That's probably 95% of the effort. The nominal mission, you can design that and go fly it with 5 or 10% of the effort. But the rest is, what do you do when things don't go right and things break and engines fail and radars don't work and that kind of thing. So he brought that process, to NASA, which we now, call systems engineering.
And then here's another audio clip where he discusses learning from the failure of Apollo 13.
Part of our training was to understand what happened during Apollo 13 and all, so we could apply those lessons to the shuttle. But most of the senior people back then thought if that failure had happened 1 or 2 missions earlier, like on Apollo 7, 8, not 9 or somewhere earlier, that or 10 went to the moon, that they would not have succeeded. They may have lost the crew. It was that close.
And then lastly, here's Dr. Terry Hart talking about Flight Director Gene Kranz.
Gene was a fighter pilot. He had some experience operationally and had all the technical training, of course. But he was best at focus and getting, as a team leader, there was no BS. It was get the job done, focus on the job. And you have all these really talented people that are motivated working for you. But, that's not enough, because talented people are all smart. Sometimes Group A wants to do something different than Group B. You get into those situations. And there was some of that during Apollo, where the astronauts were out of sync with mission control, and that kind of thing happened a few times. But he would stomp on all that kind of stuff early on and get everyone on the same page. So better than anyone, he was good at bringing that kind of focus to the team.
All right, and we're almost wrapping up here. I want to share, and I'm done with the NASA story. I want to share an article I came across in Harvard Business Review a few years ago. They had an interesting little article called 3 Ways to Create a Culture of Innovation. And I want to share just some of the key points they made here. They said, if you want your employees to be more creative in their day-to-day work, you can't rely on ping pong tables, beanbag chairs, or one-off events like hackathons. Aim for 70% success. If you expect everyone to nail a task with 100% success, they are unlikely to take risks, which is an innovation killer. Letting them know that 70% success is okay will ensure they don't play it too safe. And I thought that was really insightful because if everybody feels like they've got to be successful with everything, they're going to be afraid, and they're going to be afraid to fail. So they're not going to take risks. And so you've got to let people know it's okay to fail. It's okay to fail as long as you're learning from your failure and you're failing early in the innovation process. Now I have 2 more short videos that are going to help to summarize and expand a little bit on all the lessons we have learned in this lecture on a culture of innovation.
I am Linda Hill. I am a professor at Harvard Business School and the faculty chair of the Leadership Initiative. What I do see happening in companies that are able to innovate and really sustain their success is that they have broadened their notion of what innovation is about and who can do it. And once you begin to do that, you think about how do you build an organizational context that will allow people to be willing and able to engage in what is really hard work. So the thing we do need to remember about innovation is it's really emotionally and intellectually taxing. I had the privilege of studying the person who led Pixar, the founder of Pixar, and it took them almost 20 years to create the first computer-generated movie. Now, of course, they're mainstream, but we forget how long that process can be. Or even when I looked at Google as they were trying to develop the infrastructure for YouTube, it took them almost, I guess, 2 to 3 years working, as they described it, at breakneck speed to actually come up with a way to store the data. So we sometimes forget how patient we have to be, even if we're working really hard and quite committed to something. So what I see in organizations that are able to innovate today is they really take seriously what does it take to do breakthrough innovation, but they don't just focus on the breakthrough. You know, innovation is anything that's both new and useful. It can be about how we do products and services, it can be about our business model, it can be about our process, how we organize. Some innovations are everyday, some are more breakthrough. So because they have this broad definition and they see that other people and everybody has a role to play in that process, they build in the organization that sense. They build a culture and the capabilities required to actually utilize the talent in their organization. So I think when you begin to do that, you have a different mindset about what your role is as a leader. If instead you see your role as a leader as being the person who has to come up with the great idea, create the vision, get people to follow you to that vision, then that is about you, and you sort of focus appropriately, I suppose, on making sure that you can get that done. You set up things for that. If you instead think that it's really a collaborative activity that diverse many of us have to be engaged in, you hire differently, you really focus your mind as a leader on other things. You really focus it on what is it going to be the culture that we need, what are going to be those capabilities, because it's not about me, it's about me engaging in a process with my colleagues to innovate about a whole range of issues or challenges or opportunities that we're going to see as we're doing business. So I think fundamentally collective genius is about the idea that most innovation is a result of collections of individuals working on a problem together or working on an opportunity together. And indeed, you do have different slices of genius that you bring together to do that.
And one last video on unleashing a culture of innovation.
Innovation is always a hot topic because people, from a business perspective, it's how we survive. So if we want to scale, if we want to grow, if we want to compete, we have to innovate. We have to try new things in the market. From a people side, when we innovate, it's when we feel the most alive. It's feel like we're able to take risks and do new things. And so it has this really positive effect on the engagement and the culture as a whole. The challenge is that in order to scale, in order to grow, we end up having to standardize things. We end up having to put time pressures on people. We have to deliver, so we have to focus. And so all the things that we do to scale and grow are also the things that keep us from innovating. So the first one is fostering creativity. Fostering creativity, we talk about it as it's the price of entry and it's kind of messy. There's this really, first of all, innovation assumes something new. It's something new that adds value. So the entry point is you have to have people who are able to generate new ideas and willing to take risks themselves. Then the messy part is that as an organization, you have to tolerate the process of creating something new. It's messy, we've never done it before, so it's gonna feel uncomfortable. The second principle that we created was creating connectedness. I think that this starts with a real appreciation that openness doesn't happen unless we trust each other, and connections don't happen unless we have an open culture. And so the foundation of connectedness is trust. If you don't trust the person next to you, you're not going to be open with them, whether that's face-to-face or in an online digital format. So there's this third principle that we created called incubating ideas. There's a misconception that the eureka moment, that moment that we come up with really good ideas, happens like that. But what we've learned from neuroscience is that it's actually this really slow process where your brain is sometimes working on the problem, sometimes it's in this mode called chaos mode, and it's just networks or your neurons are firing in new ways, they're exploring new connections, and that is what creates the eureka moment, is that process of creating new connections. So as an organization, it's very similar. So we have to get good at that slow process of connecting ideas to value. So if you're like tier 1 and you're exploring ways to unleash your culture of innovation, start with a conversation. Really appreciate where people are at and that different people are going to perceive your culture differently. And then focus on the core things. 1, hire for creativity. Tolerate messiness embrace failure, and create a culture of trust, because without trust, none of this is possible.
All right, now we will shift gears and talk about our next lesson on how to succeed in corporate America. Now, if you remember in the last lesson, I talked to you about managing your own career. And one of the things I said there is your company is going to try to get you to spend 110% of your time with the company. And you can't do that because the company's not looking out for your future. You need to manage your own career. And that means you can only ever give 95% of your time to your company. You need to hold back 5% of your working time to yourself so that you can manage your career and gain the network and the skill set that you will need to enable you to succeed and get the job you want, not just in 2 to 3 years, but always be thinking 2 jobs ahead. You need to gain the skill set and the network to get that job that would be 2 jobs ahead that you might ascend to 5 years in the future. So you've got to keep yourself at just 95%. Well, how do you keep yourself at 95% when your company's always trying to throw in so much work at you that you feel like you're at 110% of capacity? Well, that's where lesson 3 comes in. It's one of the things that you can do to help you stay at that 95%. And it's what I call managing upwards. It's the notion that you should not wait for your supervisor to manage you. You need to proactively manage the relationship with your boss. And you can do that several ways. But the most important thing is you want to demonstrate that you can work independently. Because when your boss sees that you can work independently, then they're not going to micromanage you. And if your boss is not micromanaging you, then you are in charge of how you spend your time. And if you're in charge of how you spend your time, you can then carve out that 5% of time for yourself. Now, how do you do this? How do you proactively manage your relationship with your boss so that your boss is going to allow you to work independently? Well, the first thing it comes down to is being organized. And I think the best thing to do here is to always maintain a project list. And let me show you an actual example of a project list that I had when I was in my last role at Bank of America. So I always like to have a 1-page project list. Whatever you do, keep it to 1 page. So this shows the 5 projects I was working on in my last role at Bank of America. And this is exactly how I set it up. I'd say, here's the project name, here's the description of the project, just really short so my boss knows what this project is. Then I had this red, yellow, green stoplight format for the status of the project. So at a glance, my boss can see, is this in a green status? That means everything's good. Len's got it under control. I don't even need to worry about it. Yellow means, okay, Len's got an issue, but he's not concerned about it. He'll tell me about the issue, so I'm apprised about it. Red means there's a problem. Len can't move the project forward. Len's going to need my help. And so at a glance, your boss can see where you are. Key updates, just a couple of bullet points, what's going on in the project, and then next steps. So they always know where you're going. Now, if the project's in green, you might not even need to talk about the project with your boss. If it's in yellow, you're going to describe to them, here's the problem I've got, and here's why I've got it under control, and here's what I'm doing. If it's in red, I'm going to describe, here's the problem, and I can't manage this problem. I need you to help. And so this is where you're actually managing your boss directly, where you're saying to your boss, here is a task that I need you to do. So you're kind of turning things around. This project's not going to go ahead unless you do something. So in this case, it was the business. I needed feedback from the business unit president, and I wasn't able to get the feedback from the business unit president. And I was not high enough in the organization that I could just pick up the phone and call the business unit president. So I needed my boss to call the business unit president and or secure a spot on their agenda so that I could get into their meeting and resolve that problem. Now, once you have the project list, I recommend sending that to your boss every week, once a week, and asking for a weekly meeting. And I think all good bosses should have a weekly meeting with their employees. If your boss is not doing this, request them. Tell them you would like to have a weekly meeting. And then you control the meeting. You set the agenda. The agenda simply becomes, let's walk through my project. So you walk into the meeting and you show them this slide, or if you're in person, you give them that piece of paper and you just walk through this one piece of paper. The agenda is we're going to touch on each project and describe what's going on, what's the status, and where do I need your help? And when you do that, when your boss sees you're so organized that you've got this one pager here and you can run the meetings and you tell them when you need something, then they start to realize, hey, I don't have to worry about Len. Len's got it under control. Now, if your boss a typical boss might have 5 to 10 other direct reports. If you've got your stuff really organized and you're the most organized of those 5 to 10 reports, your boss is going to think to themselves, well, I don't have to spend 10% of my time with Len. If I've got 9 other people, I can spend more time with the other people who aren't as organized. And some of those other people might suffer from micromanagement and might start feeling like they're at 110% capacity. But you, because you're not going to be micromanaged and you're going to have the time to organize your work the way you want to organize it. And if you can do things very efficiently, you're going to be able to carve out that 5% of time for yourself. So I strongly recommend that you keep yourself organized, create the one-page project list, ask your boss for weekly status meetings, and control the agenda in those meetings. Demonstrate that you've got everything under control and your boss does not need to micromanage you. This all comes under this heading of managing upwards, and it will greatly help you to achieve your own independence in how you do your work and give you that time to do things the way you want to and enable you to have extra time. All right, the very last thing is I want to make sure you're aware there is a quiz based on this lecture. It's in Canvas Quizzes. It's called the Culture of Innovation Quiz. And so you will need to complete that quiz prior to our next class. And of course, if anybody has any questions, never hesitate to contact me. And that concludes our Culture of Innovation lecture. I look forward to speaking to you again. Our next lecture, we will begin the ideate phase.